I still remember the exact moment my daughter said those words to me. It was a Tuesday evening in early November. I know because the light was doing that thing it does in autumn, slanting and low through the kitchen window, turning everything golden and soft, the way it used to when Caroline was small and would sit at the counter doing her homework while I made dinner. I was standing at that same counter, cutting apples into thin slices the way she always liked them, peeled, no seeds, fanned out on the plate just so. Even though she was 34 years old by then, and I had no real reason to still do it that way except that some habits live deeper than logic. She came through the back door without knocking. She hadn't knocked in years. She dropped her bag on my chair, the one by the window that I'd had since before she was born, and she said, without looking up, without any particular build-up or warning, "Mom, you need to understand something. You've become a burden. An actual burden. I can't keep doing this." And then she took out her phone and started scrolling. I put the knife down on the cutting board. Very carefully. The apple slices fanned out in a little half circle, and I just looked at them for a long moment, because I didn't know what else to do with my hands or my face, or the sound of those words still hanging in the air of my own kitchen. A burden. I had carried her home from the hospital in my arms 27 years before that day, in a yellow blanket that I had washed 3 times before she was born because I wanted it to be soft enough. I had sat up through fevers and nightmares and the specific, terrible grief of teenage heartbreak when the boy she loved in 10th grade stopped calling. I had eaten less so she could eat more, slept less so she could sleep safely, driven a car with a check engine light for 4 years straight, because I couldn't afford to fix it and I couldn't afford for her piano lessons to stop either. I had worked 2 jobs for 3 years, days at the transcription office, 3 evenings a week answering phones for a doctor, so that she could go to the college she wanted, the one 3 states away with the good writing program, the one that would have been impossible otherwise. And in that kitchen, on a Tuesday in November, with apple slices going slowly brown on my cutting board, I found out what I had become. My name is Margaret. Peggy to the people who knew me young, which is fewer people every year. I am 67 years old. I was born in a small town in western Pennsylvania where my father worked at the mill and my mother cleaned houses for families who had more than we did. And I grew up understanding, in the particular way that working-class children understand things, not from being told but from watching, that life required effort, that love required sacrifice, and that you did not complain about either because complaining didn't change anything, and it made the people around you tired. I was the second of 3 children. My older brother Dennis moved to Ohio when he was 22 and we saw him at Christmas if the roads were clear. My younger sister Ruthan stayed close, and she is still one of the steadiest people I know. The kind of woman who shows up without being asked and doesn't need to be thanked for it. I learned a lot about loyalty from watching Ruthan, though I probably never told her that I met Robert when I was 19 years old at a church social that I hadn't particularly wanted to attend. He was 22. Tall in a quiet way, with the kind of steady brown eyes that made you feel like the ground beneath your feet was reliable. He worked at the hardware store then, but he had plans: vocational school, eventually a contractor's license, eventually his own small business. He was the kind of man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and at 19, coming from a home where my father's moods were unpredictable, that consistency felt like the most romantic thing in the world. We married when I was 21. The wedding was at the church, the one that's a CVS now, which still seems wrong to me. And there were 26 people there and a cake my mother made herself, lemon with white frosting. And I wore a dress I found at a second-hand shop in Pittsburgh that fit me like it had been made for me and cost $14. I was happy that day in the uncomplicated way that you can be happy when you're young and in love and the future is entirely theoretical. Caroline was born 2 years later. And I want to tell you honestly about that moment, because I think it matters for everything that comes after. The first time I held her, this small, serious, red-faced person who had just arrived in the world, and was already looking around like she was taking inventory, I felt something shift inside me that never shifted back. It wasn't only love, though it was that. It was more like an orientation, like a compass finding the thing it had been built to find. She became the direction that everything in me pointed. And I didn't question that for a very long time. And I'm not entirely sure even now that I should have. Robert and I had 6 good years and then several years that were good in the way that arrangements can be good, functional, civil, Not unhappy exactly, but not the thing you'd hoped for either. He was a decent man. He worked hard, came home when he said he would, didn't drink too much, was patient with Caroline in the uncomplicated way that fathers who aren't quite sure how to be fathers can still be present. But we had grown alongside each other instead of into each other, and by the time Caroline was in middle school, we were two people sharing a house and a daughter and a set of habits, and not much else. When Caroline was 12, Robert sat down at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening and told me he was leaving. Not for another woman, I asked, and I believed his answer, but for something he couldn't name. Something different from this. He said it quietly and he meant it quietly, and I understood, somewhere in my body before my mind caught up, that this was not a surprise exactly. That some part of me had known this was coming for a while, and had simply been choosing not to look directly at it, that I didn't fall apart. That surprised me, honestly. I had expected to fall apart. Instead, what I felt was something closer to a settling, like the house itself exhaling, like a tension that had been held for years was finally allowed to release. I had been working so hard to hold something together that had been quietly unraveling, and when Robert finally said the word, part of me simply let go. But I had Caroline. And I had myself. And I had work, and the specific, quiet purpose of a woman who has decided, consciously or not, that she is going to be enough. The years after Robert left were the hardest years of my practical life, and also, in a way I didn't understand until much later, some of the most clarifying years I ever lived. It was just the two of us in the house. We couldn't afford to move. The mortgage was manageable, the neighborhood was safe, the schools were good. So we stayed and we rearranged ourselves around the new shape of things. I put Caroline in the bigger bedroom. I took the smaller one. I told her this was because I liked the view of the backyard from the window in the small room. And there was a tree out there that was genuinely beautiful in every season. So it wasn't entirely a lie. I worked days as a medical transcriptionist. Good steady work, not glamorous. The kind of job where you listen to doctors dictating notes, and you type what they say, and accuracy matters more than creativity. I was good at it. I was good at staying focused and careful and reliable, which I suppose is not surprising given the personality I had developed. In the evenings, 3 nights a week, I answered phones and did light administrative work at a medical practice nearby. The doctor was a kind man who paid me fairly and never made me feel that the job was beneath either of us, that I drove a 10-year-old Buick with a check engine light that came on in the fall of Caroline's 8th grade year, and didn't go off for 4 more years. Every time I had a little extra, I'd take it to the mechanic, and he'd give me a figure that I'd have to put off for another month. Eventually it just became part of the car, like the AM radio and the cloth seats that had faded from burgundy to a dusty rose. Caroline used to say the car had character. She was being kind, and I loved her for it. I wore the same winter coat for 11 years. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters. Not because I was miserable, but because I was deliberate. Every time I looked at a new coat, I calculated what else that money could do. Piano lessons for 1 more semester. New cleats for the soccer season. The school trip to Washington, D.C. that I absolutely was not going to let her miss. The coat was fine. The coat did its job. And watching Caroline do the things she was able to do because I kept the coat, that kept me warmer than the coat did. Caroline was a remarkable child. Not in the showy way. She wasn't the loudest in the room or the most obviously talented at any single thing, but in the way of children who are deeply, quietly alive to the world. She asked questions that I sometimes genuinely didn't know how to answer. She noticed things that other people walked past. When she was 9 years old, she asked me why we didn't have as much as some of her friends' families, and I told her the truth in the age-appropriate version of the truth. That we had enough, that enough was its own kind of wealth, and that what we had built ourselves, and that meant it was entirely ours. She thought about that for a minute and then she said, "That's actually kind of cool," and went back to her book, and I sat there feeling like I had passed some test I hadn't known I was taking. She played piano from 8 to 17. I found a teacher, a retired music professor who lived 4 blocks away and taught out of her living room, and charged me 60% of her usual rate, because she said Caroline had the kind of hands that deserved to learn. I paid for those lessons on a budget that didn't have comfortable margins. There were months when I moved things around, postponed things, made things work in ways that required math I didn't particularly enjoy doing. But I had seen Caroline's face the first time she sat at a keyboard at her friend's house. That complete stillness, that total absorption that was so unlike her usual quicksilver energy. And I had understood that this was not a hobby for her. This was something she needed, the way some people need to run or to paint or to be outside in the woods. I was not going to be the reason she didn't have it. On her 16th birthday, I stayed up until 2 in the morning decorating the dining room. She had mentioned once months earlier, in the middle of an unrelated conversation, that she thought stars were beautiful. Not in a wishing on stars way but aesthetically, the actual physical objects, the way they looked in a clear sky. She'd said it once, offhandedly, and I had filed it away in the way that mothers file things away, in the part of your mind that is always, at some low level, paying attention to the person you love most. So I made stars. I cut them out of cardstock, dozens of them, different sizes, and I strung them from the ceiling with clear fishing line and hung paper lanterns between them and set the table with candles and her favorite dinner. I did it all after she went to bed and I worked by lamplight and my back hurt and I was exhausted and I was so happy I could have cried, though I didn't because I still had the stars to hang. She came downstairs in the morning and stopped in the doorway. Just stopped. And she looked at it for a long moment. The stars, the light catching the fishing line, the table all set, and then she started crying. Not dramatically. Quietly, the way she cried when something hit her deep. She hugged me for a long time without saying anything. And then she said very quietly, "Mom, you're the best person I know." I kept that sentence for years. I kept it in the part of me where important things live. I kept it for a long time. When she got her college acceptance letter, the school she'd applied to as her first choice, the one with the good writing program, the one in Vermont. She called me from her bedroom upstairs even though I was right there in the kitchen. I heard her crying through the ceiling before I even picked up the phone. "I got in," she said. "Mom, I got in." And I sat down on the kitchen floor, right there between the counter and the island, and I cried with her. Happy tears, the kind that feel like something releasing, like relief and pride and something you can't quite name, but that you recognize as one of the best feelings a person can have. I had made this possible. Not alone. She had earned it, she was brilliant and hardworking and she deserved it on every merit, but I had kept the door open. I had kept the piano lessons and the school trips and the new cleats and I had kept the door open so she could walk through it. I drove her to college myself. 17 hours, just the two of us, a rental car because the Buick would not have made it. We stopped at a diner in Ohio and split a piece of cherry pie and talked for 2 hours about nothing and everything. Her roommate, my garden, a book we'd both read, the future in the abstract way that feels less frightening when you're in a diner booth at 10 in the morning with someone you love. She told me she was scared. I told her that scared meant she understood the stakes, and that understanding the stakes was how you knew something actually mattered to you. She nodded like she was taking notes. She always took notes. When I pulled out of the parking lot of her dorm, after we'd unpacked the car and made her bed and met her roommate, and I'd stood in the doorway for one last look at her standing in this new little room that was going to be her whole world for a while. I didn't cry until I was on the highway. And then I cried for about 40 minutes, which I felt was both appropriate and sufficient. I drove home to the empty house and I made dinner for one for the first time in 12 years and I ate it at the counter because sitting at the table felt like too much. And then I went to bed and lay awake for a while thinking about what it meant to have done the thing you set out to do. And whether you were supposed to feel triumphant or bereft or something else entirely. And I decided that what I felt was grateful, which seemed right. And I went to sleep. She met Daniel in her senior year of college. He was finishing his MBA at the same school. 2 years older, Boston originally, the kind of easy confidence that comes from having grown up in rooms where you were always welcome. Caroline called me 3 weeks after they met, which was earlier than she usually called about boys. And something in her voice was different, lighter in some ways. But also, and I noticed this, and I told myself I was being too perceptive for my own good. Somehow less mine. As if she had found a new orbit, and was already beginning to adjust her trajectory. I met Daniel for the first time at Thanksgiving of Caroline's senior year. He was polite, well-spoken, asked me thoughtful questions about my work in my town and what Caroline was like as a child. He ate everything I made and said it was delicious and helped clear the table without being asked. He was charming in the specific way that people who have been well-liked their whole lives are charming. Easily, naturally, without effort. He was used to being approved of, and this was not a criticism, just an observation. You could see it in the way he moved through a room. Unhurried, comfortable. Expecting the space to arrange itself around him without his having to ask. I liked him. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the honest telling of this story. I genuinely liked him in those early years, and I saw why Caroline loved him, and I was glad that she had found someone who seemed to make her happy in this particular, specific, new way. He came from money in the way that is easy to miss if you're not looking for it. Not flashy, not ostentatious, just the low-level carelessness about certain things that people have when they've never had to calculate the cost. The right brands without thinking about them. A kind of ease in nice restaurants. The assumption that things would work out, financially, because things always had. I came from a family where you noticed these things, where the difference between having and not having was not abstract but daily and immediate, and I noticed. But I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was happy, and she was. She genuinely was, in those early years. They married 3 years after graduation, when Caroline was 26. The wedding was at his parents' property in Connecticut. A beautiful piece of land with old trees and a white tent and flowers that probably cost more than my first car. It was elegant in the effortless way that money allows things to be elegant, where nothing is strained or improvised, where every detail is simply correct. I wore a dress I had saved up for 6 months, a real dress, not secondhand, and I felt beautiful in it. But I also felt, for the first time and with a clarity that was uncomfortable, slightly out of place in my own daughter's life. Slightly peripheral to a story that was no longer mine to tell. I pushed that feeling aside. I told myself it was normal, that this was simply the nature of children growing up and building their own lives, and that my job was to be happy for her and present for her, and not to need more from her than she had to give. I was good at telling myself useful things and believing them. They moved to Atlanta. Daniel had a position at a financial firm, good work, good income, the trajectory that had been prepared for him, and that he was naturally suited for. Caroline found work at a marketing agency that she liked well enough. She was talented at it even if it wasn't the writing she'd originally imagined for herself, and they bought a house in a nice neighborhood with a good school district even though they didn't have children yet, because that was the kind of planning their life had room for. I visited twice a year in those early years. The visits were warm and easy. They cooked for me, showed me the city, introduced me to their friends. I felt, in those years, like I was a welcome presence in a life that was fully and happily underway without me, which was exactly what you could hope for, and I knew that, and I was grateful for it. But something was happening, quietly and without announcement, in the texture of our relationship. The phone calls began getting shorter. Not dramatically, a minute or two less each time, which you wouldn't notice in any individual call, but which you notice across a year. The visits became less about my being there, and more about her having her life with me present as a side element. When I came to Atlanta, I began to feel, occasionally and then more frequently, like someone who had arrived at a party slightly after the best part. When people were beginning to think about leaving, I was welcomed, but I was peripheral. And there is a difference between those two things, even when they look the same from the outside. Daniel was never unkind to me. I want to be specific about this because it would be easy to turn him into a villain, and that would make the story simpler and also less honest. He was not unkind. He was, in fact, professionally warm. The kind of warmth that is genuine in its way but that operates at a slight remove. The way warmth operates when you are being warm towards someone who is important to someone you love rather than someone important to you directly. He was courteous. He was thoughtful in the practical ways. He asked after my health and remembered things I'd mentioned. But I noticed, over time, that when he was in the room, Caroline's attention organized itself around him. Not in an obvious, performed way. Just in the quiet, gravitational way of a person who has found their primary orientation. She would begin a sentence and then glance at him. She would tell a story and watch his face for his reaction before she watched mine. Small things. The kind of small things that don't mean anything individually, and that mean everything in aggregate. I told myself this was normal. I told myself it was what happened when children grew and built their own lives and found their own people, and that my job was to be glad for it. And I was glad. I am not lying when I say that I was glad for her happiness. I just also, somewhere underneath the gladness, was beginning to understand that I was no longer necessary in the way I had been, and that necessary and loved were not the same thing, and that I was going to have to figure out how to live in that distinction. It started with small things. The kind you dismiss because each one alone is nothing. She forgot my birthday the year she turned 31. Not entirely. She texted at 8:45 in the evening, a quick message, heart emoji, happy birthday mom. Call you soon. But no call came that day or the next. I sat with my phone in a way I'm not proud of. Checking it more than I should have, setting it down, picking it up again, the specific indignity of waiting for something that doesn't come. I put it in the kitchen drawer at 8 o'clock and told myself firmly that I was being too sensitive, that she was busy, that birthday calls were not a measure of love. All of which was true. All of which was also not entirely the point. The following Christmas, they stayed in Atlanta. It was the first Christmas in 34 years that we were not in the same place. She called on Christmas morning. I could hear music in the background, voices, what sounded like a full and happy house. She said she missed me, that she wished I were there. She sounded like she meant it. But she had made a choice and the choice had been made. And I ate Christmas dinner with my sister Ruth Ann and her family and it was fine. It was genuinely fine. And I cried in the car on the way home in a way that was not fine but that was honest. That spring I had a health scare. A shadow on a mammogram. The kind of thing they see sometimes that turns out to be nothing. But you don't know it's nothing until you've had the follow-up imaging and then you wait again. I told Caroline because she was my daughter and she was the person I told things to. I told her calmly, not catastrophically. I had the doctor's words in my head, low concern, routine follow-up, almost certainly nothing. But I told her because I was frightened in the low-grade, persistent way that a week of waiting makes you frightened. I'm sure it's fine, Mom, she said. Don't catastrophize. She was probably right that it was fine. It was fine. The follow-up showed nothing. But I hadn't been catastrophizing. I had been scared and I had needed my daughter to sit with me in that for a minute. What she offered instead was a verdict. It's fine, delivered in a tone that made me feel that my concern was a problem to be corrected rather than a feeling to be held. I didn't say anything about this. I thanked her for the reassurance and changed the subject and filed it away in the drawer where I kept things I had decided not to look at too closely. I retired from full-time transcription work at 62, moved to part-time, which meant my income dropped significantly. I had been planning for this. I had a modest pension, Social Security, savings that I'd been careful with. But things were tighter than they'd been, and there were months when the arithmetic required attention. When my furnace went out in February, I handled it myself. I found a repair loan through my credit union. I called 3 contractors and went with the most straightforward quote. By the time I told Caroline, almost as a side note, a month after it happened, I had a plan and I had executed it and it was done. You should have called us, she said. And I thought, yes, I should have. That is what you say to a mother who needed help. But I had learned, gradually and without ever quite naming the learning, that I was not supposed to need things. That my needs made her uncomfortable. That the safest version of me, the version that didn't produce that particular slight tightening in her voice, was the version that was doing fine, managing fine, didn't need anything, was fine. There were comments over the years that I cataloged without meaning to. Gentle remarks about my clothes. You look nice, Mom. I just thought maybe something a little more updated. A suggestion, delivered with care but also with a kind of finality, that I should think about seeing a therapist. Not because anything was wrong, she said, but because she thought it would be good for me to have someone to process things with. And the implication, which I did not press her on, was that she preferred I process things elsewhere. Moments in restaurants or living rooms where I could feel her and Daniel exchanging a look in my peripheral vision. The tiny, private marital semaphore of 2 people who are talking about you without talking about you. None of these things, individually, would have been enough. But they accumulated. Sediment, the way sediment works. Imperceptibly, continuously, until one day the ground has changed shape. I found myself, without ever deciding to, editing myself around her, calculating what to share and what to keep, monitoring the weight of what I needed against what I estimated she had patience for, becoming smaller in small increments so that I would take up less of the space that was no longer really mine to take up. And the cruel irony of it was that I had been doing this my whole life, calibrating myself, making room, giving space, but before, I had done it out of love. Now I was doing it out of something that felt more like caution, like the management of risk. And the distance between those two things, love and caution, was something I would not examine closely enough for much too long. The year I turned 65, the stretch got harder. My hip had been bothering me for a while. Arthritis, the orthopedist confirmed. Manageable but not going away. The kind of persistent discomfort that drains you in background ways you don't always notice until suddenly you're exhausted in the middle of the afternoon. And you can't account for why. In January I caught a cold that settled into my chest and became bronchitis that sat there for 6 weeks and required 2 rounds of antibiotics and left me feeling hollowed out in a way that took months to fully shake. I was alone in the house, as I had been for many years by then. Most days I was fine with this. I had my routines, the morning walk, the garden, Ruthin on Sundays, a neighbor I sometimes had coffee with, my books. But during that stretch, the silence had weight in a way that it didn't always. I called Caroline more than I had been. I want to be honest about this. I called 2, maybe 3 times a week. Not excessively, I didn't think, but more than I had been calling. Sometimes she answered. Sometimes she texted back later. Occasionally nothing came back until I texted the next day. I told myself she was busy. I kept telling myself that, because it was probably true and because the alternative explanation was one I wasn't ready to sit with. One evening in March I called and Daniel answered her phone. He said she was resting, that she'd had a long week. I asked if she was all right. He said she was fine, just tired. And then he said something that he had clearly been preparing to say. He said that they'd been talking, both of them, and they felt it might be good for me to find some activities, some community, people my age with shared interests. It would be good for you to build a life that doesn't depend so much on Caroline, he said. He said it pleasantly, in the tone of someone delivering a piece of advice they sincerely believe is helpful, which I think he did sincerely believe. I thanked him. I said it was a good thought. I hung up. I sat in my armchair by the window in the dark for 20 minutes before I turned a light on. I want to be fair here. I have tried, throughout all of this, to be fair. And the fair version is that he wasn't wrong that I should have more sources of connection in my life. That is true and I know it, and I will say so plainly. But the way he said it, the framing of my love for my daughter as something she needed to be managed and protected from, the reduction of my calls to a kind of dependency, the clean implication that I was a problem they had been discussing, that went somewhere deeper than a piece of advice about joining a book club. After that phone call, I paid attention in a different way. Not suspiciously. Not with anger. Just with the specific attentiveness of someone who has realized they've been not looking at something, and has decided to look. I noticed that on weekends, when I called, I got voicemail more often than I got Caroline. I noticed that the last 3 visits to Atlanta had been shorter than the original plans. Something always came up near the end, a work thing, a commitment with Daniel's family, something. I noticed that she had stopped asking about my hip, though I had mentioned it was bothering me. I noticed that when she called me now, which was less often than it used to be, the calls had a checking the box quality to them, brief, cheerful, completed, the way you complete an item on a list. I tried to talk to her about some of this. I tried 3 times over the following months. Each time gently, carefully, without accusation. Each time she said some version of the same thing. That she had a lot going on. That I needed to understand how busy their lives were. That she loved me but she couldn't be everything I needed. And each time I nodded and said I understood. And we moved on and I added another thing to the drawer I wasn't looking in. What I was not yet ready to name was the thing that was actually true, which was this. Sometime in the last several years, I couldn't identify exactly when, which was itself part of what made it so disorienting. My daughter had reclassified me. Not consciously, probably. Not cruelly, perhaps. But she had moved me from one category to another. From person who matters to problem to be managed. From mother to obligation. From the woman who had made her life possible to a weight that her life was carrying. And the word for that weight, The word she would eventually use plainly and without flinching was already true before she said it out loud. So we come back to the kitchen. I picked the knife up. I started cutting the apple again, slowly, while she stood behind me with her phone. And I said as quietly and evenly as I could manage, "Tell me what you mean." She put the phone on the counter. I could feel her collecting herself, drawing in a breath, becoming deliberate, the way she had always done before difficult conversations. She was always articulate in conflict. She got that from me. I know that now with a kind of irony I don't have words for. "Mom," she said, "I love you. You know I love you. But you call me constantly. You need things from me all the time. When I don't respond immediately, you text again. And when I don't call back, you get hurt. And I can feel that you're hurt even when you don't say it. And it puts pressure on me. It's a lot of pressure. Daniel and I have talked about this, and we both feel like you've become kind of a burden to us. I know that sounds harsh. I don't mean it harshly. I just mean it's a significant amount of weight, emotionally, and I can't keep carrying it." I put the knife down again. I turned around. "How often do I call you?" I asked. She paused. "A lot." "Can you tell me how often specifically?" "I don't know exactly. Multiple times a week sometimes." 2 or 3 times a week, I said. "That's what it's been. 2 or 3 times a week." She looked like she was about to say something and then didn't. I looked at her. My daughter, 34 years old, healthy and capable, and standing in the kitchen I had kept warm for her through 22 winters, the kitchen I had decorated with paper stars, that I had left before 6 o'clock every morning, so she could go to school in shoes that fit and come home to a house that was safe. I looked at her, and I said what I needed to say, the thing I had been keeping in the drawer. "When your father left," I said, "I was 38 years old and I had a 12-year-old daughter and a mortgage and a car with a broken engine light, and I had never worked 2 jobs before. I worked 2 jobs for 3 years. I went without things I needed, real things, not luxuries, the coat, the dentist that year I had to put off, the car that should have been fixed, so that you would not go without things you needed. When you called me from Vermont at midnight crying because a boy didn't love you back, I answered. When you called me at 2 in the morning frightened about a paper you thought you'd failed, I answered. When you needed help moving into your first apartment, and I drove 14 hours to be there the weekend you needed me, I drove 14 hours and I didn't complain and I didn't need to be thanked. When you got that promotion and you called me at 7 in the morning crying, because you'd worked so hard for it, I was there. For 34 years, every single time you needed me, I was there." She was quiet. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel guilty," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you because you said I call you too much, and I want you to understand what 2 or 3 times a week looks like from where I'm standing. It's not clinging. It's not dependency. It's a 67-year-old woman who lives alone and who loves her daughter, and who is trying, 2 or 3 times a week, to stay in the life of the person she loves most. That's what that is." She looked at the floor for a long time. I watched her. I watched the expression on her face when she lifted it. The particular expression I had seen a handful of times over the years that I knew now to recognize. The one that meant she had already made her decision before the conversation started, and the conversation was a formality. "I know you've sacrificed," she said. "I know that. I've always known that. But I can't spend my whole life paying back a debt I didn't ask to have. I have my own life, Mom. I have Daniel and my career and friendships and everything that goes into being a full adult person. And I can't always be available in the way you want me to be. That's not fair to me. I'm not going to feel guilty about that anymore." The word fair landed between us like a stone dropped into still water. "You think I owe you less," I said quietly, "because I gave you more." Not a question. I was genuinely, carefully trying to understand the geometry of what she believed. "That's not what I said." "I know it's not what you said. I'm asking if it's what you mean." She picked her phone up. "I'm not going to do this. I came to have a normal visit. I didn't come to relitigate your sacrifices." Relitigate. She used the word relitigate about her own childhood. About the years I had spent loving her in practical terms, in daily, physical, financial, exhausting terms. Relitigate. I understood then that we were not going to resolve this today. Not because she was too young to understand. Not because she was too overwhelmed, but because she had already done what people do when they have made a decision they know is not defensible. She had found a language for it that made it someone else's problem. Burden. Debt. Relitigate. These were not words that arrived fresh that day. These were words that had been sitting somewhere in her and Daniel's vocabulary for a while, waiting for the moment she decided to use them. We were civil for the hour that she stayed after. We talked about other things, her work, a trip they were planning. She ate the apple slices off the plate I'd made. She always liked them. I watched her eat them, and I thought about all the plates of apple slices over all the years, and I kept my face very still. She hugged me at the back door before she left. It was a real hug, not a performed one. I know the difference, and I think she meant it, whatever it was worth in that moment. She said she loved me. I said I loved her. These things were true, which made everything else harder rather than easier. After she was gone, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time. I didn't turn the lights on. The November dark came in through the window and I sat in it, and let the thing that had happened settle over me, quietly, the way dust settles after something falls. The weeks after that were strange. Strange in the specific way of grief that arrives without the usual markers. No event to point to, no single loss you can name clearly, just a persistent hollowness beneath the surface of every ordinary day. I got up. I ate. I walked the neighborhood in the cold. I did the things that needed doing. But underneath all of it was something that had changed shape, and that I was only beginning to understand. I thought about what she had said. I thought about it carefully and honestly and with the same rigor I'd always tried to bring to things that mattered. I gave it every benefit of the doubt I had. Was there truth in it? Yes. Some. I had been calling more than usual during that hard stretch. I had been lonelier than I'd admitted to myself or anyone. I had been dealing with the hip and the bronchitis and the low-grade exhaustion of living alone when you're not quite as well as you'd been, and I had reached toward the direction I'd always reached when I needed something, toward my daughter. Maybe I had leaned harder than I should have in a period when she had less to give. I can see that. I held it and I looked at it and I said, yes, that part is fair. But the word burden was not the word of someone who had been accidentally leaned on too hard, and was expressing it imperfectly. It was a considered word. It was a word she had used to Daniel, had used with Daniel, had arrived at with Daniel, and had then carried into my kitchen and placed on the counter between us like an object she had been holding for a while, and had finally decided to set down. She hadn't said it to hurt me. She had said it because she believed it. That was what I had to sit with. I had been reclassified. The process had taken years, probably. I could see it now looking backward, the gradual movement from daughter and mother to daughter managing difficult mother, the steady drift from connection to administration. But I had not named it while it was happening. I had watched the signs and dismissed them one by one and attributed each one to circumstances or stress, or the natural distance that grows between adults building their separate lives. I had done this, I think, because naming it would have required me to act, and acting would have required me to accept something that hurt too much to accept while I was still hoping things were fine. What I understood in those weeks was that the hope had been the problem, or not the hope itself, but the way I had let the hope become a kind of permission to stop seeing clearly. I had hoped my way through years of signals, and in the hoping I had let myself become something I hadn't meant to become. A woman who had trained herself to need less and less, who had learned to monitor and reduce and edit herself, who had been making herself smaller for so long in the service of a relationship that wasn't holding her up anymore. I thought about my own mother. She passed 6 years ago, at 79, in the house she'd lived in for 40 years. She was not always easy in her last decade. She repeated herself. She was proud and sometimes stubborn about accepting help. She called more than some people might have wanted. I helped her without thinking about it as help, because it wasn't help to me. It was just love in its later form. It was the continuation of what she had given me, reflected back toward her in whatever way she needed. I never, not for a moment, thought of her as a weight. I thought of her as my mother. I thought of her as the woman who had made me possible. The difference between those two ways of seeing is not complicated. It is not a generational difference or a personality difference. It is a choice. The choice to see the person behind the need. or to see only the need and forget the person. Caroline had stopped seeing me. I don't know exactly when, but she had. I didn't reach out to her for 3 weeks. I want to be clear that this was not punishment. I am too old for that kind of theater, and it has never been my nature. It was simply that I needed to think without the static of management and maintenance and the careful, surface civility we had developed. She texted twice, brief, gentle texts, the kind that said, "I'm still here," without saying anything real. I responded each time. But I was thinking about what I wanted, about what I was willing to carry and what I wasn't, about what it meant to be a person who had spent 67 years being necessary to other people, and who was now being told that her necessity had become inconvenient. What I arrived at, in those quiet weeks, was not bitterness. Bitterness would have been easier in some ways and much worse in others. What I arrived at was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop arguing with a thing that is true and simply decide what you're going to do about it. I called her on a Sunday morning, about 3.5 weeks after the kitchen. I had thought about what I wanted to say and I said it plainly and without drama. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her. "And I want to say some things clearly, so that we both understand where we are." She was quiet. I could hear her mourning. The sounds of her kitchen, a cup being set down. "I'm not going to stop being your mother," I said. "That is not something I'm capable of and it's not something I want. But I'm going to stop working so hard to maintain a closeness that, I've come to understand, you don't particularly want. I've been reaching toward you for a while now and you've been stepping back, and I didn't name it for a long time because I didn't want it to be true. But it's true. And continuing to reach toward someone who is stepping back isn't love. It's just effort, and at some point effort without return is something you have to stop, not out of anger but out of self-respect." She started to say something. I let her finish. "I hear you," I said. "Ido. And I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I know you have a full life and I know there are things I don't fully understand about the weight you carry. But I have a life too. I am 67 years old and I have, I hope, years left, and I have been spending them waiting to be needed in the direction that you're standing. I'm going to stop waiting. I'm going to start paying attention to my own life." We didn't shout. We didn't say things that couldn't be taken back. We ended the call in a kind of quiet that was different from the angry quiet. It was the quiet of two people who have said true things and are sitting with the weight of truth. She said she needed to think. I said that was fine. We said goodbye. And then I did something I had not done in longer than I could account for. I called Ruthen. I called my sister who had been trying to get me out of the house for months, who had mentioned her book club 3 times, and whose invitations I had kept declining because I was saving myself in case Caroline called. I told Ruth and I would come to book club. She cried a little, which was not characteristic of her. And I decided not to examine that too closely. I said yes to a trip to North Carolina to see her that I had been putting off since spring. I said yes to the woman from my church who had mentioned a few months back that she was looking for a walking partner. I called her and I said I was interested if she still was. She was. I signed up for a ceramics class at the community center. I had been meaning to try it for years. There is a specific, useless way that people put off things they want to do, telling themselves they'll get to it when there's more time, when things settle down, when they don't have to hold themselves ready for something else. I had been holding myself ready for Caroline for years. I was done holding myself ready. I signed up for the ceramics class. I started cooking the things I actually wanted to eat rather than whatever was quickest. I started reading in the evenings rather than leaving the television on for background noise. I started taking the long way on my morning walk, the route that went past the reservoir, the one I had always skipped because it added 20 minutes. 20 minutes I had been saving for what, exactly? I took the long way. The reservoir was beautiful. It had been beautiful for years. I had been walking past it. I am not telling you that I healed overnight. I am not that kind of storyteller and this is not that kind of story. The grief was real, and I didn't pretend otherwise. There were evenings when I sat in the chair by the window and felt the weight of it. The full, quiet, heavy weight of loving a person who has decided, for reasons of their own, that loving you back is more than they can afford. That pain is specific and I don't know a word for it that does it justice. I let myself feel it, on those evenings. I didn't push it away or rush past it, or find a silver lining for it. I sat in it for as long as it needed, and then I got up and made tea, and went to bed. But I refused, and this was a decision, a deliberate one, made with the full force of everything I had learned about myself in 67 years. I refused to let it be the defining story of who I was. I was Margaret. Peggy to the people who had known me young. I was a woman who had raised a child alone and done it with love and without bitterness. I was a woman who had worked hard for decades and had been good at the things she chose to be good at. I was a woman who had made paper stars for her daughter's 16th birthday and driven 14 hours when she was needed and answered the phone at 2 in the morning every time her daughter called. I was all of those things, and no single sentence in a November kitchen had the power to revoke any of them. My worth was not located in my daughter's assessment of me. I had known that in the intellectual way that you know true things. I was now beginning to know it in the deeper way, in the way that changes how you move through a room. It has been close to 2 years since that Tuesday in November. I want to tell you what I found, honestly and without the kind of tidy resolution that real life rarely provides. Caroline and I are in contact. Not frequently, not in the way I once hoped for, but honestly. She reached out about 4 months after our Sunday call, a longer message, more considered than the maintenance texts had been. And we had a conversation that was genuinely difficult and genuinely real. We did not resolve everything. I don't think we will, not completely, and I've made peace with that. But we said true things to each other, which is more than we had managed to do in a long time. And there is something in that. I told her I forgave her. Not immediately. Forgiveness is not a thing I believe should be rushed, and anyone who tells you it has probably never had to do a serious one. But I told her, when I was ready to tell her truthfully, that I was not going to carry the weight of what she'd said for the rest of my life, because that would only hurt me, and I had spent enough of my life absorbing things that hurt me without being able to say so. She cried. Real crying, not polite crying. I didn't comfort her in the way I might once have. I let her feel what she was feeling, because she needed to feel it, and because the crying was not the problem. She told me things I hadn't fully understood about her side of those years. That she had been more overwhelmed than she'd shown. That she had been carrying guilt about how her life had turned out compared to the life I had. The ease versus the difficulty. And that the guilt had curdled, somehow, into resentment, which she said with the kind of shame that told me she knew that was not reasonable, and also that it had been true. That Daniel had not been wrong in his influence on how she thought about our relationship, and that she was beginning to understand what that meant and to think more clearly about it. I listened. I did not say I know or I told you so, even when both were true, because that would have been about me and not about her. And in that conversation I wanted to be about her. Daniel and I have reached a careful peace. I don't dislike him. I understand him better than I did. I understand the world he comes from and the assumptions that world installs in you and the work it takes to examine those assumptions honestly. That work is his and Caroline's. It's not mine to do for them. Ruth Ann's book club is the best thing that has happened to me in years. We meet on Wednesday evenings, 7 women between the ages of 58 and 73, and we read books and talk about them, and then we talk about everything else. The way books become doors into the things you actually want to say. We sit around Ruth Ann's dining room table until 10 o'clock and sometimes later, and I drive home on those nights feeling more like myself than I have since before I can remember. The ceramics class produced, I'll be honest, some very strange mugs. I am not talented at ceramics. My hands, it turns out, do not have the patient intuitive relationship with clay that Caroline's hands had with piano keys. My mugs are lopsided and uneven, and one of them has a handle that could charitably be described as a work in progress. I kept every one of them. I keep them on the shelf in the kitchen. I drink my morning coffee out of the worst one because it makes me laugh, which is a good way to start a day, and because I made it, which matters more than how it looks. Marcia, the walking partner from church, has become a friend. We do the reservoir route 3 mornings a week, and we talk about everything. Our children and our memories and books we've read, and the things we still want to do. She has a daughter too, with her own complications, and we don't talk about those complications in the way of women complaining about their children, but in the way of women who have loved people fiercely, and are trying to understand the shape that love takes when the people you love grow in directions you didn't predict. I planted a kitchen garden last spring. Tomatoes, basil, 2 kinds of lettuce, a rosemary bush that has gotten dramatically bigger than I expected. I eat things from it every day in summer, and I can tell you that there is a specific, uncomplicated pleasure in eating something you grew that I recommend to anyone. I am not going to tell you that I don't still have evenings when I feel the loss. I do. The loss is real, not the loss of the person, because Caroline is still there, and we are still in each other's lives, but the loss of the relationship I had believed I had. The one where I was needed and close and part of the daily fabric of her life. That relationship may have been more something I built in my own mind than something that existed in the same form on her side. I don't know. I may never know exactly. But I have stopped needing to know, which is its own kind of freedom. What I know is this. I had spent most of my adult life being useful, being available, being the steady, reliable, self-effacing presence around which other people's needs arranged themselves. This was not something that was done to me. I made choices, real choices, out of love, and I do not regret them. But somewhere in the making of those choices, I had come to believe, in a way I hadn't examined clearly, that being useful was the same thing as being worthy. That my value was located in what I produced for other people. That if I was not needed, I was not justified. That belief, I'm telling you plainly, is a quiet, slow poison. It feels like virtue when you're living inside it. It feels like love, which it partly is. But it is also, underneath the love, a kind of erasure. An agreement to be a function rather than a person. And the agreement becomes so natural over time that you stop noticing you're in it. I am 67 years old. I have, I hope, more years ahead than I can count. And I intend to live them as a person. Not as a mother only, though I am that and will always be. Not as a function, not as an obligation, not as a check in the box. As a woman who walks the reservoir route on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday mornings, who makes lopsided mugs she keeps on her kitchen shelf, who reads until late on evenings when the story is too good to put down, who sits around Ruth Ann's dining room table on Wednesdays and talks until 10 o'clock about books and life and everything that matters. As a woman who knows the difference between what she has lost and what she has never lost, and who chooses every day to tend to the latter. If you are a mother, or if you have a mother, or if you have ever been the person in a relationship who gives more than they receive and tells themselves it doesn't matter, I want to say something to you directly. You are not only what you have done for other people. You are not only the sacrifices you have made or the needs you have filled or the emergencies you have absorbed or the nights you have stayed up or the times you have said, I'm fine, when you were not entirely fine. You are not a function. You are not a debt to be paid or a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved by building a life that doesn't depend on you. You are a person, with a history that has weight, with a life that has its own momentum and its own meaning, with needs that are real and legitimate and do not require justification. The word burden has never been the true word for a mother who loved her child with everything she had. Not once in the history of all the mothers who have ever lived. It is always the wrong word, applied by people who are struggling with something in themselves, guilt, distance, the discomfort of being loved more than they can currently return, and who find it easier to reclassify the love than to examine the discomfort. That reclassification is not the last word. It is not a verdict. It does not get to stand without challenge. You can challenge it simply by continuing to know who you are, by taking the long way past the reservoir, by making the lopsided mug and keeping it on the shelf, by sitting around the table on Wednesday night and talking until 10 o'clock with people who are glad you're there, by being here, fully, stubbornly, quietly, gratefully here. That is enough. It always was. If something in this story sat with you, if you recognized yourself in any part of it, whether you are the mother or the daughter, or simply someone who has felt the specific pain of loving more than they were loved back, I want you to know that you are not alone in that. There are so many of us with a version of this story. The details are different kitchens, different words, different Novembers, but the shape of it is the same. The love that doesn't know where to put itself